I think I already know your answer to this. And if I do that, I am on the same side as you are, but I'm going to just tease it out. So in February last year, and we talked about Russia invasion of Ukraine. And so in February, US, EU, and UK and Canada announced some Russian banks would be disconnected from the SWIFT banking system, which basically cut off Russia's from the international payment system. Furthermore, they targeted Russia's central bank by preventing the Kremlin from accessing its up to about, I think, more than $600 billion, which is made up of reserve in the US and in US dollar in among other countries. So these type of actions have raised fear in other countries that rely on the SWIFT for commerce and the US dollar as a reserve currency. That perhaps one day something like that could happen, right? It's like almost like a coercion by the United States to take arbitrary action against them. So a number of countries have been slowly diversifying away from the US dollar as the sole reserve currency. And in the case of China, has made a number of bilateral agreements to settle trades in the renminbi, and probably have more thinking about through this One Belt, One Road or Belt and Road initiative, that all these trades among these other countries, much smaller countries, to also settle in RMB. So these actions have raised the question, is the US in danger of losing its dominance as a reserve currency status? Thoughts?
Well, I've written at least one longer paper on this, and I do encourage people to search its weaponization of the US dollar. What can I tell your viewers that or listeners that they may not have heard? The first thing I would point out is the big surprise last year was not that the dollar was weaponized. That was not the surprise. The big surprise for Russia and China was that the dollar meant the dollar in quotation marks, i.e., the dollar and all of its friends. Because what did the Russians diversify into when they sold their dollars? Well, yes, some gold, but particularly euros. Euros and some other currencies. But it turns out holding a euro or a yen or a sterling or a franc or the Norwegian krone, geopolitically, they're all the dollar. It doesn't matter. And now in economic terms and in reserve management terms, yes, they're very different. And they have very different performance in a reserve basket. But geopolitically, they're the same. And that was really the big revelation of last year. And so therefore, you're really, from a pure FX reserve, central bank reserves point of view, you really have no alternative to the dollar, because what we've tracked over the last 2 decades is, yes, there is a search for some diversification in the reserve world, but the diversification are US allied currencies. And so that doesn't give you the hedge for, on the geopolitical side. It does give you a hedge in terms of yield differentials, in terms of FX risk and appreciation and so forth. But it does not give you the geopolitical one. So that's one very big surprise from last year. The other one is, again, and I'm trying to focus on things that people may have missed. It's easy to sanction a country that's dependent on money. It's very hard to sanction a country that has it plenty or is generating surpluses. Now, Russia is an oil producer, so it generates a lot of surpluses. We, the West, basically sanctioned a large chunk of the surplus, froze the reserves, that's basically the years of surpluses. And then what happened? Well, Russia continues to sell oil, continued to generate surplus. Now, it doesn't sit on the central bank reserves. It now sits in some Russian commercial bank account. But the end effect is still the same. They're accumulating more money than they're spending. And so therefore, the effect of the sanction is meaningful, but we should also be somewhat humbled as to what the effect can be. And that matters because when we think about China's risk appetite, their cost-benefit calculations, the fact that China continues today and continue in the future to be a surplus generator also means that financial sanctions would be meaningful, but they are not as powerful as some people may imagine they are. For a deficit country, for a country that's dependent on foreign financing, like a Turkey with chronic account deficit, sanctions would be existential. But for surplus generators, that's not the case. Now, I say all of that because it takes us back to this whole discussion around surpluses and deficits matter, because at the end of the day, we are one world, we're one earth, and things have to net out. And so if you have surpluses on one side, you have deficits on the other. That's how, so you sold more goods, the other side bought more goods than they sold. And now you have an asset and a liability mix. Now that has to match up. The ones that accumulated surpluses have capital that they have to put somewhere. And they can either put it in their own economies, which means their own exchange rate goes up, which China is very reluctant to do. Or if it's in oil countries where the currency is pegged, as you know, you get huge inflation because the domestic money supply goes through the roof. And if you don't want to do that, which is the right prudent choice, well, then you have to invest the money abroad. And now where are you going to put the money? Especially if it's trillions. No, Philip, imagine I was a client of yours and said, here, Philip, I'm not, take my 3 or 4 trillion and do something with it. But please don't invest it in the US. Well, good luck with that. Finding a home with 3 or 4 trillion, actually it's multiple more than that if you add it all up. But the reality is that there is no way around it. And so that's the US dollar dominance is also a reflection of the world we live in. And so as long as the world looks the way it looks, surpluses in one part of the world, deficits in the other, and as long as there's not a real credible alternative, that's dollar dominance, whether we like it, don't like it, whether we want to do away with it, or whether we want to reinforce it. That doesn't matter. It's a structural reality, and it'll be with us for some time.